Good afternoon and welcome to the 10th Annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signing Event, sponsored by Gettysburg National Military Park and the Gettysburg Foundation. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service at Gettysburg. And over the years, as we have presented the Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signing Events, we have had the pleasure of hosting renowned authors and historians, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides talk to you about their perspectives on history, the Battle of Gettysburg, this year, 1864, and the American Civil War at large. Coming up next, Ed Root, Jeffrey Stocker, and Dick Jacoby will present To the Copse of Trees and Beyond. Ed Root has served on the board of the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation and on the Stage 2 jury, which selected the winning design for the Flight 93 National Memorial. Jeffrey Stocker, attorney and avid historian, is past president of the Civil War Roundtable of Eastern Pennsylvania and he serves as their legal counsel. Dick Jacoby, a retired school administrator, has measured these fields being cited today and has drawn maps to closely coincide with the descriptions in the book. Please join me in a warm welcome for Ed Root, Jeffrey Stocker, and Dick Jacoby.
Thank you, Cindy. My name is Jeffrey Stocker. What we're talking about today, it's titled To the Copse of Trees and Beyond. The book is about the 15th, 19th, and 20th Massachusetts Infantry Regiments at the Battle of Gettysburg, which fought on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. The three regiments combined brought a total of 642 officers and men to the field of Gettysburg. In the 2 days of fighting, they directly lost 89 men killed and mortally wounded, so 14.5%. Earlier this year, one of my friend's dads died. He was 91 years old, and when we were in the cemetery and my friend was giving a talk about his dad, he said that when he goes into cemeteries and he looks at the gravestones and it says 1958 to 2014, he doesn't look at the beginning and the end dates. He looks at the dash, and he thinks about people's lives in the dash. So I told him I was going to plagiarize that remark from my talks. And what I wanted to talk about today is some men of the 15th, 19th, and 20th Massachusetts who paid the ultimate price for their service at the Battle of Gettysburg. The first one is Lieutenant Colonel George Ward of the 15th Massachusetts. And I want to talk about a little bit about each one of their lives. George Ward is on these photo montages we have here. George Ward was born April 26, 1926 in Worcester, Massachusetts. Prior to his enlistment, he worked in Worcester as a machinist. He also served as a brigadier general in the pre-war Massachusetts State Militia. On July 14, 1861, when the 15th Massachusetts was formed, he was appointed a lieutenant colonel of the regiment. At the Battle of Ball's Bluff on April 21, 1862, he was shot in his left leg and his left ankle, and this caused such severe damage that it resulted in the limb being amputated. He finally returned to service with the regiment in the spring of 1863. One of his men said that he was a stern disciplinarian, if not severe. So he was not very popular, at least with this man in the regiment, but as Ed will talk about, he probably had a pretty high degree of popularity with the other men. When he returned in the spring of 1863 to service with the regiment, he resumed command of the unit. His last letter home, he wrote, was dated June 27, 1863. He told his wife, "We have not seen the worst of this rebellion yet. I almost shudder at what we are to pass through before the struggle is over, but I still trust and believe that things will come out well. One thing is certain, our men will fight much better with their faces turned homeward." At the time of his enlistment, he was married, and he had two sons aged 6 and 2 years old. So he's writing home to his family about this impending battle at Gettysburg. On the late afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, the 15th Massachusetts, together with the 82nd New York Infantry Regiment, were moved forward to an advanced position to the right, as you're looking from the Union line, of the Codori House along the Emmitsburg Road. They were overwhelmed by an attack of Wright's Georgia Brigade. Right near the beginning of the assault, the line of the 82nd New York, which was to the left of the 15th Massachusetts, started to crumble. And the Confederates advanced from left to right up the Emmitsburg Road and started crumbling then the left of the 15th Massachusetts. Seeing this situation unraveling quickly out of control, Ward, who had a wooden leg, as I said, ordered his men to retire. He was on foot, so he could not move fast, and he was shot in the back of the right leg. Two of his men stopped, and they carried him off the field in the midst of this turmoil and brought him to a field hospital in the rear. He died there on the morning of July 4th, 1863. His body was transported home to Worcester, Massachusetts. He was buried in a cemetery in Worcester, July 8th, 1863. After his death, his wife and his two children got a pension of $30 a month, plus $2 for each of his sons. So they got $34 a month, and they had to live on that. And that was what was left of George Ward. In comparison to George Ward, one of the, quote, minor members of the regiment was a man named George L. Boss. Boss was either born in 1841 or 1842 in Worcester, Massachusetts. Most of the 15th Massachusetts was enlisted from Worcester County, Massachusetts. At the time of his enlistment into Company B of the 15th, which took place on July 21st, 1861, the day of the Battle of First Manassas, Boss listed his occupation as a building mover. In the fighting on July 2nd near the Emmitsburg Road, Boss was wounded in the right thigh by a shell fragment. He was carried again, like Ward, he was carried to a field hospital in the rear. One of his comrades saw him there, and he wrote this after the war in a pension affidavit in his own pension file, not Boss's, but this particular man. And he said that Boss was a pathetic soul. He said that he had laid with his injuries untended until the evening of July 4th, when with a blanket draped over him for protection from the rain, he crawled to the comfort of a fire where he died. So he died far away from home, huddled underneath his blanket by this fire. He's buried under the name of George Bass, B-A-S-S, in the National Cemetery. That was the original notation. Fortunately for Boss's legacy, his stone has been corrected. His father got a pension of $8 a month. Another man in the 15th Massachusetts who was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg was a man named John Marsh, Jr. He was born on August 12, 1835 in Sandwich, Massachusetts. At the time of his enlistment into Company B, which took place on November 26, 1861, he was married, he was living with his parents, and he was working as a palm leaf splitter. In the Battle of Antietam on April 17, 1862, he suffered a gunshot wound to the right leg, but he soon returned to duty. In the fighting on July 2nd, one of his comrades saw Marsh aiming his rifle at one of the skirmishers from the 15th Massachusetts who were retiring before the onslaught of Wright's Georgia, and he thought that Marsh was actually going to shoot the skirmisher. He called Marsh a desperate man to fight. On July 3rd, 1863, in the fighting near the Copse trees, Marsh was shot and killed instantly. He was survived by his father, John Sr., age 58, his mother, Anna Maria, and two younger sisters, age 14 and 12. Marsh's father had worked before the war with the New England Glass Company, but was disabled due to asthma and rheumatism, and he was forced to rely on his son's military pay and the charity of his friends. That's what it said in the pension file, the charity of his friends, to keep the family's household updated with their bills. He got a pension of $8 per month with the death of his son. John Marsh Jr. is buried in grave D2 in the Massachusetts plot in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. A man who is not buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery, but is buried on the field of Gettysburg, is First Lieutenant Herman Donath of the 19th Massachusetts. And Donath is one of the people that we have up there. Donath was born in 1842 in Hanover, Germany. According to the terms of the 1860 census, at that time he was living with his father, his mother, 4 younger brothers, and 1 younger sister in Roxbury, Massachusetts. His father owned no real property and only had $50 a month of personal property. So they were a very, very poor family. After the firing on Fort Sumter, Donath enlisted as a private in the 1st Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. He deserted, though, less than 2 months later on June 30, 1861 in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. He was never apprehended as a deserter. He enlisted on August 28, 1861 as a private in Company K of the 19th Massachusetts. He was almost immediately named the regiment's sergeant major. Just after the Battle of Fredericksburg, He was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant and then the first lieutenant in the spring of 1863. In the fighting on July 3rd at the Copse of Trees, the 19th Massachusetts launched a counterattack on Pickett's breakthrough in conjunction with the 42nd New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The United States flag, the colors of the 19th Massachusetts, the color bearer was shot down. Donath was the first person to pick up the flag and race to the head of the regiment, leading the onslaught to the Copse of Trees. He was shot in the chest and fell dead instantly. After the battle, his body was buried by Catherine Thorne in the Evergreen Cemetery, where his body still rests today. So he is not buried in the National Cemetery. He is the only member of the 3 Massachusetts regiments to be buried in the Evergreen Cemetery. After his death, despite the fact that his family was very poor, they did not file for a pension. So his family got nothing for his death. Also up on that poster board is Sherman Robinson. Sherman Robinson was a second lieutenant in Company A of the 19th Massachusetts. He enlisted in the regiment on August 28, 1861. At the time of his enlistment, he was unmarried. He was working as a shoemaker in Newbury, Massachusetts. His older brother, John, had also enlisted in the 19th Massachusetts, but he died of disease on October 30th, 1862. There were 2 Robinson brothers in the family. There were 2 children in the family. John died on October 30th, 1862. You all, I'm sure, have heard about the great cannonade that preceded Pickett's charge that lasted an hour and a half, 2 hours. The second shot that came over in the cannonade actually hit Sherman Robinson. The first shot flew over the ranks of the 19th Massachusetts, which was stationed in the second line behind the Copse of Trees, and it landed in the field beyond, sort of bounding towards Meade's headquarters. At the sound of that shot going overhead, Sherman Robinson, who was eating a sandwich, stood up, and the second shell hit him in his left side and literally tore him into pieces. So Robinson is presently buried at the top of the Massachusetts plot in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Being too infirm for work, immediately after hearing of his second son's death, Stephen Robinson, Sherman's father, began receiving a federal pension of $15 a month. That was for losing both of his sons. $15 a month is what he ended up with. You always hear, too, when people are talking about the cannonade and you're reading about the great cannonade, Henry Hunt, the Union artillerist, called it a grand humbug, and people talk about how it didn't really cause a lot of casualties and it failed and all this other stuff. Well, Sherman Robinson obviously showed that it cost him his life. Another man whose life was forfeited in this cannonade was one of the guys I really feel sorry for in these 3 regiments. His name was August Duttling, D-U-T-T-L-I-N-G. He was a private in the 20th Massachusetts. He was a native of Prussia who had immigrated to the United States with his family. He arrived on July 7, 1854 in New York City. His family soon thereafter moved to Massachusetts, where he found work as a farmer. He was working as a farmer in July of 1861 when he enlisted in Company D of the 19th Massachusetts. At the time of his enlistment, he was unmarried, but he was the sole support for his widowed mother, Esther. And he lived with Esther, and he gave all his money that he earned from his job home to Esther. Esther didn't speak English very well, and Esther was illiterate, in fact, in English. In her son's pension file, she signed with an X. One of the people that was killed then in this cannonade prior to Pickett's charge was August Duttling, and in his pension file, it states graphically that a shell exploded right underneath him as he was lying in the line of battle in the 20th Massachusetts, and it said it blew his bowels all over the field. So after his death, his mother, who was 56 years old, filed for the standard pension, and she began receiving a pension of $8 a month. To add really insult to injury, in his stone in the Gettysburg Cemetery, his name is listed as Augustus Deitling, D-E-I-T-L-I-G. So he's not even buried under his proper name, and he died for his adoptive country. I see my time is running out, so I'm going to talk very quickly about a couple other people who are buried in the National Cemetery. Okay, one of them is Patrick Manning. Patrick Manning was born on August 23rd, 1834, in Hampton County, Massachusetts. At the time of his enlistment into Company D of the 20th Massachusetts, he was married with a 2-year-old daughter, and he was working as a shoemaker. In the fighting on July 3rd at the Copse trees, he was shot in the arm. The regimental surgeon, who's up there on the board, Nathan Hayward, excised both of his radii, which is the bones in his arms. So even though his arms were not amputated, his arms were completely useless because the bones were gone. Despite that, he got blood poisoning, and he died in the Second Corps Hospital on July 12th, 1863. He's buried in the Massachusetts plot. After his death, his widow got $8 a month for herself and $2 for her young child from the federal government as a pension. The last guy I want to talk about is where we got the title for our book, Sumner Paine. All right, Sumner Paine was a second lieutenant in the 20th Massachusetts. He was born on May 10th, 1845 in Boston, Massachusetts. At the time of his enlistment, he was unmarried. Unlike these other gentlemen that I've talked about who all enlisted in 1861, Sumner Paine enlisted in the spring of 1863 in the 20th Massachusetts. Paine was a Harvard student, all right, and the 20th Massachusetts was known as the Harvard Regiment because the story goes so many of the people in the regiment were from Harvard University, either students or professors. When we did the research, I think I found 37 out of the 995 or something who were affiliated with Harvard, so it wasn't a very high percentage. One of them was Sumner Paine, though. Sumner Paine was a student at Harvard University who had been kicked out of Harvard for what they called youthful indiscretions. One of the last straw was, the last indiscretion was the fact that one of his professors was in the professor's office. He was taking his ease in the office. Sumner Paine closed the door from the outside, and then he nailed a board across the office door so the professor couldn't get out. So with that, he was expelled from Harvard University. After he left Harvard, he joined the 20th Massachusetts. He was immediately appointed a second lieutenant in Company F of the 20th Massachusetts. The 20th Massachusetts saw very limited fighting in the Chancellorsville campaign. So when the regiment got to the Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, Paine really had not seen any combat, unlike most of the members of the regiment. He had very particular ideas about discipline. He was not very popular with the men of his company. He had some of the men of his company strung up by their thumbs. He had some others walking the barrel or walking around carrying a barrel, riding the rails. He had all these particular youthful ideas about discipline, and the older men in his company really couldn't stand him. On July 3rd, 1863, after the 20th Massachusetts decimated Kemper's men to their front at Pickett's charge, they were ordered to advance to their right and reinforce the breakthrough of Pickett's men and stop the breakthrough of Pickett's men at the Copse trees. The person who probably led the counterattack was Sumner Paine. In all his youthful glory, Sumner Paine was yelling, forward to the Copse trees, and he was gesticulating with his sword, and he ran forward at a high rate of speed. Within 15 yards of where the marker is now, which I'll talk about, to the 20th Massachusetts at the Copse trees, he was struck in his left leg by a ball, and he was knocked to the ground. It shattered his left ankle. And he leaned up, and he was yelling and pointing with his sword. He was yelling, "Isn't this glorious? Isn't this glorious?" And at that moment, one of the Confederates in the field out to the front shot him in the chest and killed him instantly. He's buried right near Sherman Robinson in the Massachusetts section of the plot in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. One of the things I hope I conveyed, albeit poorly in this talk, is when you go into this National Cemetery or the Evergreen Cemetery and you look at the markers there and you see the names, you realize that those were all people. They left families behind. They all had dreams, aspirations, goals. They all ended right here at the Battle of Gettysburg. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Why do people write books? Heaven knows there's been enough books at the Battle of Gettysburg. The story of our book really started as a preservation project. If you go to the Copse of Trees today, the southern side of the Copse of Trees, you'll see three metal signs, three metal markers. Those signs were placed there in 1891. Sometime in the early 1950s, somebody at the Park Service decided they really weren't necessary. Maybe they thought they were in the way. Maybe they thought it made it harder to cut the grass. And they took them down. Now, the story of these three regiments and those signs goes back to 1885, because the monuments to the three regiments were initially placed around the copse of trees. After they were taken down in the 1950s, the Park Service, the historians, always felt that they should be placed back where they were, because they helped tell the story of those three regiments on that day in July. The park received permission in 1985 to put them back. The problem became those three signs were on three very large metal pillars, about 12 feet high. Between the 1950s and 1985, two of those three pillars disappeared. Unfortunately, as happened far too many times with the Park Service, they didn't have the money to refabricate the pillars and put the signs back up. So fast forward a little bit longer to 1993, when the Civil War Roundtable of Eastern Pennsylvania, for which Dick and Jeff and I all belong, and our group had a history of working with the Park Service and other historic entities in historic preservation. And we talked to the historians at the park, and they told us of this dilemma, and we decided to fund putting these plaques back. And it was like $600 for each of these huge metal posts. So a round table raised the money, we donated it to the park, and in 1993, those three plaques were placed back up there as you see them today. Fast forward a little bit further to the early 2000s, and we decided to bring friends of ours down from the round table and give a talk about these three regiments. Well, as we started to do research about the three regiments, about the men that Jeff talked about the history of their monuments, we thought, wow, this is really interesting. We kept finding more information. We said, this would be a great magazine article. We thought maybe Gettysburg Magazine or Civil War or something like that. And we did some more research, and we said, wow, maybe this will be a two-part magazine article. And over 5 years later, it ended up as this book. In the early 1880s, the veterans started to come back in groups. Even before then, veterans came back here. Colonel Macy of the 20th Massachusetts came back here the month before Lincoln's address with three other men, and to look at the battlefield, talk to the people in the hospitals, and really see where they fought. In the early 1880s, 1883 to be exact, veterans groups started to come back. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts were both among the state leaders about starting to put monuments on the field of Gettysburg. Massachusetts, each regiment was given $500 to form a monument. So they came down in the 1883, and they walked around in all these different regiments. They were placing stakes to where they wanted their monuments. The early preservation, Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association, became the entity that had to deal with all these veterans, that had to approve and understand where these monuments would go so that it all made sense. The monument to the 15th and 19th Massachusetts were completed in 1885. Where they were originally placed, if you can see on the picture here, the 15th Massachusetts is right, the first one. The 19th Massachusetts was actually next to the 15th Massachusetts, and then the 20th Massachusetts is the one closest to the Emmitsburg Road. All those monuments were basically facing west toward the Confederates. The 19th Massachusetts monument in particular, the men were so proud of their role here and what they did. The monument says that the regiment stood here, big letters, stood here on one line on that afternoon. Fast forward to the next year. The regiments came back again, and even the veterans got confused about exactly where they were and what happened. We always go back to a story. My dad and Jeff's dad both fought in Europe in World War II. And one time my mother was kind of quizzing my dad and kind of giving him a hard time because he really couldn't remember exactly what town he was in and where he was on this. He served with the 4th Armored Division. And my father finally exasperated, said, "I wasn't there as a tourist." And so many of these veterans, the same, they were interested in one thing, staying alive, doing their duty. They really weren't knowledgeable about the big picture. Probably those of us here today in this audience maybe understand the big picture of the Battle of Gettysburg more so than most of the soldiers who actually fought here. So only a year, less than a year, after the monuments were placed, the veterans of the 19th Massachusetts themselves asked the Gettysburg Memorial Association to move their monument. So it's in the center of the three monuments to the south end of the Copse trees, and they wanted it moved to, you can see it here in that picture, we're right in the front of the Copse trees. If you go there today, there's that big book, that big monument that's a big open book. Their second position of the monument was right there in front of where that monument was later put. And you can almost hear the veterans saying to themselves, "Why did those guys last year put it over there? We came in this way." More and more regiments from more and more states in the 1880s came here to put up monuments. If you look at that picture again, you'll see a monument with a cannon next to it. That cannon belongs to Cowan's Independent New York Battery. That was dedicated in July 1887. So now things really get confusing, because if you look at that picture and you look at the situation, it looks like Cowan's cannon are firing right on the 15th, 19th, and 20th Massachusetts, because they're right in front of the cannon. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association started to realize that things were getting a little bit out of control. They wanted the battlefield to be where visitors at that time to today could come to the battlefield and really understand what happened. And they came up with something that they called their brigade line of battle. And they decided that monuments had to be put up on this brigade line of battle where the regiments within a brigade were formed, and that would make more sense than trying to just crowd all these monuments in together in one particular place throughout the battlefield. To make this whole situation a little bit more confusing, everyone here has probably seen the monument to the 72nd Pennsylvania near the stone wall on the north side of the Copse trees. It's the one with the soldier with the clubbed musket over his head. Around this time, the 72nd Pennsylvania wanted to put their monument up. There's a brigade monument to the 72nd PA and the rest of the regiments in that brigade, midway between Hancock Avenue and the stone wall. 72nd PA wanted their monument down by the wall. The Gettysburg Battlefield Monument Association said, "You know what, guys, you really didn't start there. Your brigade line is on the other side of Hancock Avenue. If you look today, there's some limbers and caissons on that side of Hancock Avenue. That's where the association wanted to put the monument to the 72nd PA. The 72nd PA said, "Well, wait a minute. You let those Massachusetts guys put their monuments up by the Copse trees." So being good Pennsylvanians and politicians, they took them to court. And it ended up far more time than we have today, but it ended up before the state Supreme Court. So it's going back and forth and back and forth. And the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association finally said, "You know what, fellas, we have to move those Massachusetts monuments." So they did. The 15th Massachusetts monument is now some 235 yards south of the Copse trees, along the line with all the other regiments in Harrow's brigade. The 20th Massachusetts monument is that big rock that you see along the line there south of the Copse trees, gigantic boulder. That's moved about, 120 south of the Copse trees. The 19th Massachusetts monument was moved 119 yards down on the other side of Hancock Avenue. So now the 19th Massachusetts, if you drive up Hancock Avenue toward the Copse trees, the monument to the 19th Massachusetts is facing east. Now, if you remember, when it was initially placed, it was placed at the Copse trees facing west toward the Confederates with the words, "Stood here." Now, if you stop by that monument, and most people frankly don't because they drive up to the official stop at the Copse trees, and you look at the monument to the 19th Massachusetts, it says, "We stood here You look at that monument and say, these guys weren't too involved. They were way back here and everything else was going on up there. As all this was going on, the Preservation Association is writing letters. The letters never got initially to the regimental associations. They didn't even know about it really until the monuments were moved. They weren't happy. They weren't happy at all. In the court case with the 72nd PA, Colonel Devereaux of the 19th Massachusetts and Adjutant Hill actually went to Philadelphia to testify. And when we first started getting into all the research, Devereaux came from Indiana, and Hill came from Boston, Massachusetts, all the way to Philadelphia in the dead of winter to testify in this case. And until we learned more, we couldn't figure out why the heck would they care enough to come all the way from Indiana and Boston to testify against the Philadelphians. But as we went on and we really learned what was going on here, that's the reason for it. They were still upset about it. The Gettysburg Battlefield Monument Association, to mollify the veterans, came up with this idea of the 3 plaques, which started our whole story to begin with. And they said, we're going to put these plaques up and we're going to, that'll be able to tell your story. This whole time period is going on from the 1880s into the early 20th century. The veterans themselves were the ones who really maintained the monuments. If you look on the monument to Colonel Ward, which is near the Emmitsburg Road, and you look at the regimental monument to the 15th Massachusetts, you'll see that the bust of Colonel Ward is white. The soldier in the 15th Massachusetts monument is white. That's because originally it was marble. Over time, the elements damaged both of those monuments. The monument to the Colonel Ward, the bust of Colonel Ward was actually taken off, and the Gettysburg Battlefield Monument Association in those days was really a no-frills organization. The commissioners actually went to that monument, took the thing off, and mailed it up to Boston. The members of or Worcester, rather. The members of the regiment had a bronze replacement fabricated, sent it down. They went so far as we found letters where the veterans are actually talking about what bolts to use to put this thing back together again. So they were very involved with all of the monumentation. The actual monument to the 15th Massachusetts, the regimental monument, was actually shipped back to Massachusetts. So the soldier marble could be replaced with the bronze one that you'll see today on the battlefield. Because until 1893, the Gettysburg Battlefield Monument Association is the ones who controlled the battlefield. They're the ones who bought the land. They're the ones who tried to, I don't want to say fight with the veterans, but everybody had their perspective on these things. And the men of the Memorial Association honestly tried to do the best job possible. Obviously, a lot of the veterans, depending what the decision was, they didn't necessarily agree with those decisions. So, as all this is going on, the veterans still come back. They still have their reunions. We discovered that many of the veterans that came back were not veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg. Too many of them were already gone. They had either died at the battle here, mortally wounded, were killed in later battles of those regiments. And what we really discovered that they used the word comrade a lot. And in the 19th century, among those soldiers, that was a word that was used a great deal when you read the 19th century letters. And what we discovered, what that really meant and how they really felt, was not necessarily what man fought in what battle, if he was wounded, because they knew it was more than that. They knew that many men were in the service and they became ill. Maybe never a casualty per se from a bullet or a shell, but their lives were still shattered because of their service. And another veteran really described it best, and I'll quote, "These monuments are not to commemorate the dead alone. Death was but the divine acceptance of life freely offered by everyone. Service was the central fact. That fact and the truth these monuments commemorate." He kind of summed it up by saying, Those who fell here, those who have fallen before or since, those who linger yet a little longer soon to follow, are all mustered in one great company on that great shining height of life. And that's how they felt about it. The 15th Massachusetts came back here in 1898 and also 1900 as part of their trips. And what we discovered when they came back here in 1898, they wanted a group picture taken. Well, where did they have that picture taken? Their monument is 235 yards south of the copse of trees. When you look at the old pictures, the old books, or certainly if you read some of the publications that are out today that Tim Smith and Gary Edelman have done, and they've done a lot of work in the monumentation, the veterans went where their monument was. Well, what we discovered was, and I don't know if you can see it, but the veterans of the 15th Massachusetts had their picture taken right in the front of the copse of trees. That's what was important to them. That's what they wanted to commemorate. So, to finish off our little travail of these poor regiments, the plaques are being put up. Well, in the meantime, I mentioned before the great big book monument at the copse of trees, right in front of it, that John Batchelder put up to list every unit that fought in Pickett's charge. Well, remember, the monument to the 19th Massachusetts originally would be right in front of where that big book monument came. Well, they certainly didn't want to put the plaque to the 19th Massachusetts right in front of that monument. So what they decided to do is they just kind of slid it around. So now if you go there today, the monument, the plaque to the 19th Massachusetts is really where the monument to the 15th Massachusetts really stood. The plaque to the 15th Massachusetts is where the 19th started out, and the 20th Massachusetts is actually right where it belongs. Matter of fact, when the Park Service put that plaque back up, they actually struck the foundation of the original place where the monument to the 20th was placed. So our purpose in doing this book, and our purpose in trying to tell the stories of what happened to these men, we certainly understand what the association was trying to do. We're not trying to get the monuments placed or put back anywhere than where they are now, but we hope that people, if they understand what these men did here, will maybe appreciate their story a little bit more. And if you do go past the monument to the 19th Massachusetts and you look at it and it says they stood there, you'll know that they really didn't stand there. They did much, much more. So the stories of the men who fought there, they're everywhere. That if you know where to look, their voices are out there if you know where to listen. So we always like to say, tread softly as you walk these sacred fields, because the voices and the stories are there. Thank you very much. We'll take questions. Hold on, bud. What do you want to? Yep. Pardon me? Fell off. Here, I'll put it back. Can you get it? Yeah, it just clipped on there to the belt. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
What did the people thought the monument was we stood here, but it was actually I stood here, right?
Well, this is my grandson. He's a plant, by the way, so I had to get at least one question, and we knew we could answer. Well, I think I can answer it. We said it represents the regiment, all of them. So we, or I, meaning the regiment, but it represents all the men in those regiment where they were on July 3rd in the battle. Yes, sir.
Any comment about Colonel Ward's monument? We don't have too many of them like that. Was that provocative at all?
Well, you can jump in on that.
go ahead.
One of the really things that we found in this book where we felt really good about is that, as Jeff mentioned, that Private Bowen didn't like Ward, didn't like him at all. And we never were able to pin down what it was that Bowen held against Ward, but he didn't like him at all. And in his memoir, which many historians have used, have picked up on this, that Ward was a martinet, he was just a bad officer, nobody liked him. And you'll go on many walks today or read different articles where Ward is portrayed as that martinet. But what we discovered was that when the veterans came back and money was given out by the state for the regimental monuments, the men themselves, the veterans, decided, we need a monument to Colonel Ward. So the veterans themselves, a militia unit in Worcester, and other civilians in Worcester all donated. That wasn't from the state, that wasn't from any large entity. So we really came to believe that one man's opinion can really color how history looks at someone. And Ward, when you think about it, he's wounded terribly at Ball's Bluff, he loses his leg. He didn't have to come back, but he did. And he's carried off the field. If the men hated him that much, they would have left him on the field. The Confederates are overwhelming them, coming around all sides, but they get him off the field. And unfortunately, he's mortally wounded and dies. So, in a way, we feel that people who read this book will hopefully maybe redeem Ward's reputation a little bit, that he is not the poor leader that has come down because of Bowen's book. I mean, when you face about it, any of you that have been in the military, I don't know that colonels usually hang out with privates anyway. They don't usually hang in the same social circle. So maybe one of these days we'll come upon something that will explain more with Colonel Ward and a little bit more of his story about why Bowen felt that way. Thank you for that. Thank you.